All right, so now we're going to tie one of my favorite flies for one of my favorite hatches for the spruce moth. Now, the spruce moth is it doesn't have any aquatic life cycle. It is a forest pest, but it's a native insect and it feeds on the buds of the spruce trees. And every year, usually depending on the weather, between the third week of July and maybe the first couple of weeks of August, the spruce moths will come out. And it's all kind of determined on temperature. Another thing that's determined is how cold of a winter you have. If you have a really cold, rugged winter, you won't have as many spruce moths the following summer. If you have a mild winter, then the spruce moth activity could be really, really good. And so anyway, you want to definitely listen, visit the Dan Bailey website, call the shop and figure out when the spruce moth hatch is happening. And any river that has a spruce forest next to it up in the mountains will probably have these insects, and it is a lot of fun. As far as what time of day, you've got to be an early riser for spruce moths. As soon as the sun starts to hit the tips of the trees at the tops of the mountains, which is early, the spruce moths will come out. And so the fishing is good right at 8 o'clock in the morning, sometimes earlier. And then during the heat of the day, they kind of go away. But then the gray drakes come out, which is fun. But the fish are used to seeing the spruce moths. You can still fish them. And then in the evening, they will come back a little bit in the evening when it starts to cool. But you want to be out there in the morning for sure. And call your fly shop and call Dan Bailey's and figure out when that hatch is happening. All right, so the hook. I'm a little big on the hook today. I'm using a size 12. But these are probably more like a size 14. Okay, so size 12 or 14 hook is going to work. So that's our hook, dry fly hook. It's a 1 extra long shank. We are going to be using kind of a tan colored thread, I guess. So kind of a tan colored thread. You can also use an orange thread for this fly, kind of a rusty orange, because there is some orange in the body color of the insect. I'm just use a tan today. The wing is going to be elk hair. The hackle is going to be like a whitish, kind of a cream colored hackle. The dubbing, which I'm going to make for you today, is I've got some orange dubbing and I've got some white dubbing. I will mix this together to create kind of a creamsicle type color. All right. And I think that does it for materials. Yes, it does. So let's get started. All right. So we're going to start the thread, and again we're just going to start the thread till about the middle of the hook, and then we're going to come back. All right. This is a popular fly. It's not my own pattern. I've seen lots of other people tie this, and I said, that looks pretty good, so I started tying it myself. First thing we're going to do is we're going to put an elk hair wing on, and like I said in the gray drake video, people say, how much elk hair do I use? Well, a good starting point is right about the gap of the hook. Right about the gap of the hook, and we're going to go with that. So I'm going to cut that elk hair off, and the elk has insulating fur called duff. It's kind of fuzzy, and you can kind of see it stuck right there in those. If you don't get that under fur out, your dry fly will absorb water and it'll sink quicker than it normally would. So I knocked all that out of there. Okay, so I'm going to take my hair stacker and I'm going to put this in the hair stacker tips down to even this hair out. I'm going to tap it a few times on the table. Here it is. Should be nice and even now. Yes, nice and even. All the tips are uniform. And we want to use hair about as long as the hook shank, okay, about as long as the hook shank. And I'm going to tie this down right behind the eye of the hook. I'm going to give this bobbin a counterclockwise spin so that thread will lay right against my fingers. Like suppose if you were left-handed, you would use a clockwise spin. Look at that, ties that in real nice. Well, that might not be long enough, a little longer, there we go. Tie that in. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to work this thread all the way down. I'm going to create what's called a pontoon body. So I'm working this thread all the way down toward the curve of the hook. And when I get here, I'm going to cut off those butts, but I'm going to leave a little bit. I'm not going to cut them off clean. I'm going to leave a little stubby, just like that. All right, so got that tied in. Next thing is my hackle. And I'm going to select a hackle, and I've used this net quite a few times. I'm going to have to really search for the right size here. Oh, lucky day, there's one. Now, I'm going to tie this hackle in by the tip. I'm going to isolate the tip of the feather, and I'm going to tie, there it is right there. I'm going to tie that in by the tip, right there. Tie that down, maybe go forward a little bit and catch it a few times. So I've got the hackle tied in. So now I'm going to create the dubbing, and I've got this white dubbing, kind of creamy colored. I got this orange dubbing, got a couple elk hairs in there. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to get those elk hairs out. I'm just kind of mix them together in my fingers like this. Just kind of keep pulling them back and forth and mixing them. I know that some people, when they mix big batches of dubbing, they'll actually use an old coffee grinder, and they'll put theirs in there, and then they'll spin that coffee grinder. I'm just kind of mixing it in my fingers. I want that orange and white mixed together. Here it is. I'm going to get a little bit more orange. It's not quite orange enough for me. One thing you always want to look at when you find, another good tip is when you're out fishing in the middle of July, you definitely want to look at the back eddies and the calm waters, rain puddles, and you want to look for these spruce moths laying dead in those puddles. Because if you see them in those backwaters, those eddies, or storm puddles or whatever, then you definitely want to start fishing a spruce moth. Now, another pattern that works really well is an elk hair caddis tied very lightly with a white hackle and really light colored elk hair. There, that's better. I've got a nice orange tint in that dubbing. It's going to make a nice body. Anyway, an elk hair caddis in a very light colored elk hair caddis will work really nice for that. Now, when I do my dubbing, I'm going to put just a little bit of dubbing on here. Spit on my fingers. My fingers are really dry. I don't use wax. I'm just going to spin. Now, I want a really, really thin body, because the thing is that this pontoon body that I put on here already put a lot of mass on the hook. So I want this dubbing to be a very tight, very sparse rope of dubbing on here. If a person makes, and I'm going to hold it up here so you can see, it's not much bigger than the diameter of the thread. All right. So I might need a little bit more, but we're going to see if that'll cover the hook. So we're going to work our dubbing forward. There we go. Yeah, I'm going to need a little, oh, maybe not. Oh, perfect. There we go, just like this. Now, this is going to be what's called a bullet head fly. And when you tie a bullet head, it's really, really important to leave a little bit of empty space between your dubbing and your elk hair wing. And I'll show you why in a second. All right, so now I'm going to use my hackle pliers. Even though this feather is kind of long, I'm going to clip my pliers on here, and I'm going to come around the body, and we're going to palmer this hackle forward. What I mean by palmer is when we come around, we create a gap between each winding of the feather. I got about 5 turns out of that, and now I'm going to tie that off. Always bring the thread up and behind, about 4 or 5 times. So there's our hackle. This is a little different feather than the saddle hackle that we used on the gray drake. This is kind of a one-use feather. So after I clip that, that's pretty much going to the garbage. Whereas the saddle hackles, you can get tie several flies out of one feather. All right, so now we're going to create that bullet head. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my thread forward just a little bit more to the eye of the hook to really get that elk hair right on the eye. There we go. I'm going to bring it back, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this back like this, and then I'm going to bring the thread around, and there's my bullet head. I'm gonna come around with a few tight wraps right there. Okay. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tie 1/2 hitch before I whip finish. I always like to tie 1/2 hitch. I've got a 1/2 hitch tool on my bodkin. And I'm gonna do 1/2 hitch first, just to hold everything together. And now I'll do my whip finish. Whip finish. And then fly tire's best friend, a little bit of crazy glue. Now, the crazy glue is good because, now remember, you want to knock a lot of that glue off there. You don't want all that glue. I'm going to put some on the knots, but I'm also going to kind of coat that bullet head. That bullet head, that crazy glue will penetrate into that bullet head and make that be a little more durable for you. Last thing is I'm going to trim these hackles right on the bottom. I'm going to trim it real close. I want this to sit right flat in the water. So I'm going to trim those hackles on the bottom. Leave the ones on the outside so it sits real low in the water. Anyway, that's a spruce moth with a pontoon body. I've seen a lot of other fly tires tie this, like Bob Jacklin and others, and this is just a really good pattern for around here. Very durable, very visible, and it catches fish. If you want to go a little bit easier, you can tie an elk hair caddis with a very light dubbing and a light hackle and a light wing, and those work pretty well too. But I've actually kind of fallen in love with this fly over the last 5 or 6 summers, and it's the one that I tie for spruce moths.